start if you don't mind. Thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I know that a lot of you have already had a long day, but we're in for a really special treat today. It is with pleasure that I introduce our guest tonight, Vladimir Kozlov, who is going to be presenting his film called Traces in the Snow. First, I will read a little introduction of the director and of the film. Vladimir Kozlov was born in Mogilev, an industrial city in what was then the Belarussian Soviet Socialist Republic and is now the country of Belarus. He spent his childhood and adolescence in the suburbs of that city, witnessing the collapse of the Soviet Empire and a bizarre mix of unbridled freedom, wild capitalism, and rampant crime in the early 1990s, before moving to Minsk, the capital of Belarus, and later to Moscow. Kozlov has a dozen fiction and non-fiction books to his name, many of which have been shortlisted or longlisted for major book prizes. He's the winner of the prestigious Made in Russia Award in the Literature category for year 2013, and was also nominated for GQ Russia's Writer of the Year in 2011 and 2012. Excuse me. Kozlov's novels and short stories have been published in translation in the United States, France, Serbia, and Slovakia. He debuted as a film director in 2013 with an adaptation of his novella Desyatka, in English number 10, which collected the Bronze Award at the debut film festival Spirit of Fire in Khanty-Mansiisk. Kozlov subsequently made snegu, the film that we'll be watching today, a groundbreaking documentary about the influential Siberian punk rock movement of the 1980s, and that features Kozha, Anomiya, and zakhotim. Okay, before we move on to the introduction of the film, I have an exciting new development here. Vladimir Kozlov has brought with him 2 copies of his most recent book, Diary of a Perestroika Kid, in English translation, one of which is generally brought as a gift to the Hunter College Library, but the other one is going to be the award for the best question asked tonight after the viewing of the film. I think I may be in the running as well. Okay. Traces in the Snow is a feature-length documentary on Siberia's punk scene in the 1980s. Directed by Russian author and film director Vladimir Kozlov, this first-of-its-kind documentary uses rare footage of Siberian punk legends, including the punk poet and songwriter young Desyatka and the controversial godfather of Russian punk, Mogilev, along with contemporary interviews to recount the story of Siberia's improbable punk scene. Arguably the very embodiment of the underground, Siberian punk existed not only thousands of miles away from the movement's epicenters in New York and London, but also at the height of the Cold War, a time when playing punk music might literally have landed you well in Siberia. Kozlov's documentary looks at how, in spite of, or perhaps due to, its relative isolation, the scene thrived and inspired its members to produce some of the most original punk never heard. The resulting feature is a revelatory look at a scene at once alien and yet somehow deeply familiar. With this, without further ado, we give you Traces in the Snow. Would you like to say, make a few opening remarks before we start?
Hi. Well, thank you for the introduction, Margarita. I'd like to thank Hunter College for having me for this opportunity to screen this film, and also I'd like to thank everyone for coming, for being here now. I won't bore you too much before the screening. I'll just say that for me, this film is not just about the Siberian punk rock scene. It's a film about an important period in the Soviet history, about the 1980s, about the period that coincided with the end of the Cold War and the beginning of reforms that gradually led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I think, at least to some extent, this film reflects sensibilities of young people of that era. I'll be here after the screening, and I'll be glad to answer whatever question you might have. And also, as Margarita said, the person who asks the best question, the question which I think is the best, 1980s, and it's semi-autobiographical, so to some extent it is also related to this broader topic of the Soviet Union of the 1980s. Have a nice spring. See you later.
And the government, basically, because they mentioned very briefly that they used to be picked up by the cops, by the KGB. One of them made a fleeting reference to spending some time in a psychiatric institution. Maybe you could talk a little bit about what that means and sort of their general interaction with the authorities.
Yeah, absolutely. To some extent, these guys in the film were happy because their activities were around 1995, 1996, almost coinciding with the reforms that were initiated by the then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, known as Perestroika and glasnost. And because of that, they were able to avoid the worst consequences of what they were doing. Because what they were doing basically qualified as anti-Soviet activities, and earlier they cracked down, and Gorbachev was sent to a psychiatric institution and spent several months there. Moreover, there is unconfirmed information that KGB officers tried to force him to commit suicide when he was in that psychiatric institution. And another member of the Danska Baron, Konstantin Rabinov, was sent to the mandatory military service, even though he had a heart condition and wasn't supposed to serve at all. So our authorities were, of course, unhappy about all those activities because they were considered suspicious, they were considered subversive, but because the overall climate in the country was already changing at the time, the consequences weren't that hard as they could have been under other circumstances. Oh, yeah. First,
did you consider for the documentary interviewing any government representatives, so people who were in the KGB or who are in municipal authorities or anything like that, to get sort of the other perspective of their approach?
I understand your question, but those people were anonymous. It was impossible to find out who exactly did what, because frankly, a lot of former KGB officers basically changed their allegiances, and they are doing quite well under a totally different different political system. Just take Russia's president Vladimir Putin. He's a former KGB officer. So those people who cracked down on Siberian punk musicians, it's impossible to figure out who they were. They wouldn't talk about it, and again, Russia is not a very transparent country, so finding that out was really complicated. Someone mentioned me some major in Omsk, but again, it wasn't confirmed that it was specifically him who harassed Gorbachev at the psychiatric institution. Of course, it would have been interesting to get their perspective, but even judging by other situations, by other experiences, even if it was possible to determine who exactly they were, if I had reached out to them, they wouldn't have agreed to be interviewed.
Even in the case of like city police, like maybe not on the KGB side, but maybe like city officials.
But
or were they more?
They weren't really involved.
Yeah, okay.
It was all about KGB mostly.
Okay.
You had a question?
Where would they have become acquainted with punk rock in the first place? Like, where would they have heard KISS, for example? Were there underground recordings? Or there were?
That's a very good. That's a very good question. Because the Soviet Union was isolated from the rest of the world, specifically from the West. There was this so-called Iron Curtain, and Western culture didn't, hardly made it through that Iron Curtain. It was always a problem. However, some records still made it to the Soviet Union because those few people who were able to travel, or like Navy merchants and other people involved in international travel, they brought Western records to the Soviet Union and sold them at a profit. So they were these unofficial record markets. They were called mostly record exchanges. They existed in all major cities of the Soviet Union. Normally it was like Sunday, people would gather somewhere. It wasn't technically illegal because authorities just didn't know about their existence, or if they did, they tolerated it because they didn't think it was something really subversive. Just a bunch of people, a bunch of music fans exchanging records. Of course, some records were actually sold at those exchanges, but they pretended to just exchange them. And I think just about anyone who was in this Siberian punk rock scene, they got records by the Sex Pistols or by the Clash through those record exchanges.
I'm sorry, you had a question about.
It's kind of a difficult question because you're interviewing older people at a very difficult time right now. But I mean, you listen to Yanka and the Grove. I mean, these are dark things. You know, these are dark, very inundated things. You know, there's Vysotsky in there. There's stuff in there that people that never expected the regime to go away. Did they expect the regime to go away in the late 80s? Even though it was kind of...
Are you referring to that Soviet regime, right?
Yes. At the time, do they remember themselves feeling like things were getting better? Because they were writing very dark music.
Actually, they hoped the regime would go away. Their dark songs expressed sensibilities of people who lived under that regime, and of course, it was pretty dark. I remember it myself. I was maybe like 8-10 years younger than those people, but I remember the 1980s quite well. And I think if I try to speak not for those people in the film, but for people who lived in that period in general, I think pretty much everyone was some kind of rebellious against that regime, and pretty much everyone hated that regime and hoped and really expected it to go away. And again, the Siberian punk rock scene, it's probably its peak coincided with reforms. 1985, 1986 reforms already began, and of course it wasn't clear where exactly those reforms would go and where they would take the country. But still, there was some hope that something will change for the better.
Yeah, thank you so much for the film, first of all. I think it's very important and relevant today. And my question is, you spent time, interviewing these people. What kind of mood and how would you describe the mood that they're in and their generation? And are they still rebels? I know a lot of people of whom you talk are not alive, but those who are, how do they live in the current times, and what is their mood? And I will just mention the second question too. Do you see that these people have the young followers or any movements that would be rebellious as well? That's something that's moving right now that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for your questions. I'll answer the first question first. I think most of those people were kind of bitter because, frankly, they didn't achieve much in terms of recognition. Of course, it wasn't probably what they wanted to at the time. They started out as punk musicians, but still, when they were in their 40s and early 50s, of course, they wanted something else. And those who are still active as musicians, as members of bands, what they are doing is still very marginal. And there was some kind of bitterness. And also there was, of course, some were disappointed about changes in contemporary Russia because the current regime is much closer to the Soviet regime of the 1980s than, for instance, the 1990s Russia, which was a very free country. And answering the second of your questions, I don't think there is a movement in contemporary Russia similar or comparable to the Siberian punk rock scene of the 1980s for a number of reasons. I think, frankly, there was an element of coincidence in this Siberian punk rock scene. Those people happened to know each other, happened to help each other, to feed off each other's creative ideas, and they happened to be in geographical proximity. Omsk, Tumen, Novosibirsk, cities located close to each other. And also because they lived outside the biggest cities, outside the biggest cultural centers such as Moscow and Leningrad, and were not involved in that commercialization which had already begun in those in the music scenes of those cities. They were different. They were more outspoken, and thanks to that outspokenness and their talents, they were able to express that anti-system, anti-Soviet, anti-regime attitude probably in a better way than other musicians, even punk musicians did. In contemporary Russia, it's different. Overall, it's different because culture and arts are much more fragmented. It's more of a niche stuff. Back in the 1980s, punk as an idea, as an ideology, as a movement, it was something new for Russia, for the Soviet Union. It was cool, it was rebellious. These days, punk is just one of many styles of music, one of many styles of clothing. Again, if we try to compare contemporary Russia with the Soviet Union of the 1980s, Russia is still a freer country. You don't have to, you don't have to be a member of the youth communist organization. Nobody forces you to do that. Nobody forces you to come in touch with authorities unless you want to do it because you want to receive some government money for your creative activities. It's possible to do something totally outside of any official systems and have a huge or just a decent following. So, of course, there are similarities between authoritarianism of the 1980s and contemporary authoritarianism in Russia, but it's still of a different nature. And this kind of regime, this kind of authoritarianism hasn't become a push to some rebellious underground culture. I don't see any movement similar to that Siberian punk rock in the 1980s.
What elements do you find are probably the most essential to the formation of counterculture movements in general? For example, it was mentioned in the film a few times that Leningrad and Moscow didn't really have the same push that Siberia could have had, and they talked about certain different contradictory things for why this could be, that Siberia is Siberian laziness, Siberian grit, is the weather, so many different things. What do you think, both in the present day and then, could be the essential that you highlight as necessary for a true counterculture movement?
Thank you for this question. First of all, my commentary on those discussions of Siberia and role of Siberia in the creation of this kind of music. Frankly, I don't share all those ideas. I've spoken. It's not. I've spoken a lot with these people, and they try to express their ideas why Siberia is special. It's only part of those statements made it to the final cut of this film. They were all, believe me. It's just I wasn't convinced with anything of that, and I just I really said it, and I can repeat it again. These people coincided to live in Siberia. They were very talented. They met each other. They helped each other. That's all. So if it's not that you have to live in a special place to do something special in creative terms. Coming back to the first part of your question, what elements are essential for counterculture? As far as I see it, first, it has to be in opposition to mainstream culture. If you are trying to do the same thing that is done in the mainstream and official culture, it just means that you've been unable to make it to break into the mainstream. If you are doing the same thing, it has to be different. It has to be alternative. It has to be in opposition. Then, for instance, more specifically, talking about contemporary Russia, we have censorship. Officially, we don't, but one simple example is a regulation that was passed, I think, 5 years ago, banning profanity in film, in songs, and in theater. It's other than censorship. It's and again special relations with language, and I consider it a very offensive thing to do, trying to censor language. Languages develop in their own ways, and when the government tells people what they can say and what they cannot, not just regular people, but crazy people, what they can say in their films, in their books, in their theater pieces, it's totally not okay. So another element of counterculture would be protesting censorship and doing the contrary. If they prohibit profanity, then something countercultural has to have a lot of profanity. That's an example that came to my mind. I don't know if I've been able to formulate it. It's actually really a very broad and difficult question, but at least I hope I expressed some of my ideas about what counterculture has to be. And again, something to add. We have to admit that a lot of things have already been done creatively. It's really hard to come up with something really innovative, something really experimental. I often hear stuff about a film, for instance, being experimental, but it is is very similar to experiments that were done like in the 1950s or 1960s. It's not experimental anymore. It might be experimental in comparison with other films made these days, but still it's repetition of what has already been done. So the field for experiments, for innovation is still rather narrow. You just draw on what's been done in the past, and a lot depends upon how creative you are, how talented you are in dealing with all those available styles, genres, elements, and how you are able to tell your story using all those components.
So Yana was the only female punk artist mentioned in the film. Were there no other emergences, like of no female punk bands after her?
Well, of course, there have been many. She just happened to be the only female member of that Siberian punk scene. It's just, but at that time it really was very unusual. It was considered, well, music in general, rock and punk rock specifically was considered sort of a men's club. And the fact that she was there by doing what she did, I think she kind of provided an example for other female musicians, punk musicians, to go ahead and do their things and totally ignoring all those gender stereotypes that existed at the time.
Oh, so not to sound kind of creepy, but I did a little research on you before coming here, and I looked at some of the titles of your books and stuff, and I realized they had to do with like subculture in general and kind of stuff like that. You know, we were watching a movie about Siberian punks and stuff, and I wanted to ask, so do different subcultures and just, you know, punk rock and all that stuff, did it impact your life, or do different subcultures, did they impact your youth, and how did you come to being here right now? Pretty much. And this question is kind of not about the movie itself, but about you. I'm trying to find my way in life. I need advice. How did you come to be here? Regarding
Okay.
regarding pop culture, how did you come to be here?
I'll try to answer your question, although it might be a little bit difficult. Basically, I've never been part of a subculture because I lived in a place where it was basically impossible. I grew up in a suburb of an industrial city, with and the majority of people in my neighborhood were probably the local equivalent of American rednecks. They weren't. If you tried to be subcultural, if you, for instance, if you tried to have a mohawk as punks, or if you grew hair as metalheads, it was like a death sentence, you know. It wasn't a good idea. So I just when I visited other cities and I saw those subcultural youth, I was kind of envious, and I understood that in my neighborhood, in my situation, it was out of the question. But at that time in the 1980s, it was probably the most popular form of rebellion against not just parents or school. It was the most popular form of rebellion against the system as well. So I unfortunately I did not participate in that. But later, when I began my writing career, when I began making films, of course, so this interest in subcultures, it sort of re-emerged, and I was able to do a few books related to subcultures, and I was able to talk about it in some of my fiction books, and also some relation. There was some relation to it in my films. How did I ended up here, speaking in front of you? I don't know. It's hard to say. I've made films. I've written books, some of which were translated into English. I think hopefully it's some kind of recognition, some kind of showing interest in what I'm doing in the part of universities outside Russia, which I really appreciate. Sorry, I couldn't be more specific.
No, because honestly, when I saw that, a lot of your writing had like those roots within pop culture and stuff like that, I imagined you would be like one of those maybe old school rockers that you somehow had roots in that. And I was like, yeah, this guy probably had, he was probably down there jamming out to those musicians. And I'm kind of shocked. You never went to any shows or anything?
No, I went to shows. I went to shows as a regular viewer. I wasn't. I mean, there were people who looked more as cultural, countercultural, but I didn't know them until much later. Again, it's not. I don't think it's a problem. It's on the other hand, it's good because you are sort of an impartial observer, which is also a good thing to be, especially in this specific situation of Siberian punk rock, because those people who are still, those members of that movement who are still alive, they're not in good terms with each other. They've been talking to me. They've been telling me different stories, and because I didn't take sides, I think I was able to be a little more objective. I didn't want to take sides, and so being an observer is sometimes good. But also one thing that's those youth subcultures, the way they existed in the 1980s, maybe 1990s and early 2000s, they don't exist anymore. I think this whole subculture thing is over. It's what's left is a style of clothing and a style of music. People listen to something similar to a punk movement or to the hippie movement. That's not going to happen again. It's over.
You had a question there. Good. So the people mentioned at the end of the video who died, I was looking at the years and they all seemed to die pretty young. So like they didn't get to live very long. Do you think it was their lifestyle that contributed to that, or?
Yes, you're right. So of course, this punk rock style contributed to that to a large extent. Well, some people they had some health conditions, but mostly, of course, they drank heavily. Some of them used drugs, and that certainly contributed to their early deaths.
And then around the 90s, the film mentioned a shift from like regular punk rock to the savage kind of punk rock. Can you just explain what really triggered they called it savagery?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a phenomenon that's a little bit harder to explain, because initially punk rock, when it emerged in Russia as a movement, as a scene, in the second half of the 1980s, it was originally embraced, especially Siberian punk rock, was embraced by intellectuals, by people, by more intelligent people who saw something in the lyrics, who saw this rebelliousness. But later, when it was getting more popular, when, again, thanks to the reforms in the country, those Siberian rock musicians were able to play legitimate shows, and there was some kind of hype around punk rock and rock music in general. When general audiences began to show up at those concerts, a lot of those people were just
breaking
really
things?
savages. Like they weren't into ideas behind the songs. They were into that animal raw energy, which is of course part of punk rock and which is important. But they just took that component and acted accordingly, and they just destroyed venues where concerts were played. Of course, to some extent it was because venues weren't really suitable for punk rock shows, and we just didn't. In the Soviet Union, we didn't have proper clubs, we didn't have proper venues for punk rock. And those were just regular sitting venues. So of course, people who wanted to dance, to slam dance, to do something, they sold those seats and they just broke those seats. And of course, imagine a punk rock musician on the stage seeing nothing but a bunch of people destroying everything, breaking the seats. Of course, some people were disappointed because of that, but they wanted to get ideas across, and instead of that, they were getting some kind of savagery, as they refer to it.
Oh. What do you think the next counterculture media movement will pop up, maybe in Putin's Russia or Belarus?
I think I already tried to answer this. I think we are living in a different reality, in a different way. We won't have any. It's my prediction. I might be wrong, but we won't. I think that we won't have any major countercultural movements or scenes or groups. Everything is extremely fragmented these days. Everything. We hardly have national or major national artists. It's all about specific scenes, people who are interested in specific acts and specific scenes, and it's all about that. For instance, there is a rather strong rap scene in Russia. It's been strong for a few years. It's been controversial to some extent. It had problems with local authorities a few months ago because local authorities weren't happy with the lyrics promoting sexual promiscuity and violence and drug and alcohol abuse, which I think rap artists promote everywhere in the world. But again, it doesn't look like this is a major movement. It's just part of a huge alternative culture, which isn't even underground. They play legitimate shows. They have huge followings, and even those attempts to ban them on the part of local authorities basically led nowhere because the central authorities said, no, come on, don't do that. Don't antagonize young people because of bans that are not really political and are not trying to subvert the system. So I can't imagine any major countercultural movement. It's probably, I think, individual artists, musicians could emerge, but hardly a scene or a movement.
So I don't know. I mean, in terms of what you have right now, I mean, there's a place in Krasnogorsk called Vegas City Hall. My cousin was there yesterday with 1 million other like-minded, slightly nostalgic individuals with, one previous aquarium. Who were around back then, they're around now, they're probably the Van Halen equivalent. They still sell out to that same generation, like all these like Russian rock, that also existed, but at the same time you have Pussy Riot. Are they both just methods of appeasement essentially and useless in terms of change?
Again, this is a complicated question. I'll try to talk about that a little because you mentioned Aquarium, Grebenshchikov, all those rock bands of the 1980s. For those who don't know them, it's pretty much all rock music was banned in the Soviet Union, and a lot of bands that were not really subversive or political, they were underground just because communist censors were short-sighted and didn't understand anything about youth culture. So when the ban was lifted, a lot of formerly underground acts were able to legitimately record and tour, and some of them really became huge stars in the late 1980s, like Aquarium or DDT or Alisa and a few other bands. And to some extent, they were associated with the youth rebellion of that time, and there were even theories suggesting that rock music contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union, which to some, probably small extent, is true. But then, in the 90s, those bands were basically commercialized. They focused extremely on making money rather than anything else. And in Putin's Russia, they initially felt very comfortable because they were making money. They weren't supposed to praise Putin or something. There was a notorious meeting in the Kremlin I think in the mid-2000s, to which representatives of a lot of those older rock bands were invited. And eventually it came to a situation when those rock heroes of the 1980s who were against the Soviet regime, it turned out that they were basically supporters of Putin regime 25 years later. And so they are, even though at some point some of them still changed their minds and made some statements or tried to be sort of neutral in the situation, it's already clear that they have nothing to do with rebellion, and they are not anti-system, they are not anti-regime, they are the way they are. They are into making money, into living comfortable lives, being rock stars, rock heroes, like their own rock heroes from the West, whom they were envious back in the 1980s when they were underground. You also mentioned Pussy Riot, which was a totally different phenomenon. They were
condoned, also kind of.
Oh,
I mean, in the same way,
they were
kind of limited, right?
I think they were kind of unique because they were anonymous. They didn't want to promote themselves. They were subversive, and these are kind of traits that are typical of any underground activity. And but they were more into performance arts. They weren't really into music, as far as I understand. This is a point I've made several times actually over the last few days. Like, who knows a single Pussy Riot song? No, they don't have. They don't have songs that somebody could even know, because it was just part of their image, being somewhere doing some performance art with guitars. So they were more into performing art, into very subversive, bold performances, but not into music. Unfortunately, when authorities cracked down on them, they basically suppressed them, and whatever they've done since their prison term is no longer underground, is no longer rebellious, and I don't think it can be considered as something really important in terms of a threat to the government, for instance, in terms of a threat to the regime.
Okay, so I'm so sorry. I'm just going to say we have time for maybe 2 more questions. So this is your chance to vie for the prize. Go ahead.
Let's see. You mentioned the prize now, so.
Do you want to think about it first?
See, you mentioned that, it was mentioned in the film that many of these rockers knew that their project was sort of hopeless because they were facing this mammoth that was the state, and they didn't see any, even though it was perestroika, they didn't necessarily see a necessary end in sight to the regime. What do you think is the internal sort of, I'll ask it this way, temperamentally, when you encounter these individuals in the film, what differentiated them from the rest of their generation? Let's say, my parents, for example, they're also born in '64, like many of these rockers. They were very anti-Soviet regime. They had many materials in their possession that were forbidden for the time, but they were able to sort of blend into society.
Mhm.
What do you think temperamentally set these individuals apart who sort of made themselves known and cut their hair this way or put themselves out there?
Yeah, to some extent you already answered your question when you said that your parents were able to blend with the rest of people. I think it's about being an outcast. It's about feeling different from other people around you. Most people were willing to join the youth communist organization, Komsomol. Most people were willing to praise the Communist Party's general secretary at some meetings and events that were mandatory in secondary schools, for example. And there were people who just who hated this stuff so much that they didn't care, that it could lead to some problems for them, or they consider themselves outcasts, and they just when again, plus they were created to some extent, and when they figured out, well, they could play punk rock, they went ahead and do it.
What was the lasting effect of the Siberian punk scene? Was there any? And like, I mean, obviously we're here talking about it today, but would the world be different? Would the rock scene in Russia be different? Like, what would be different if anything had it not happened, had it not existed?
It's a hard question. It's hard to measure it. It's hard to measure it, but I'll give you some. It will be a vague answer. I'm frank about it. It will be vague, but maybe it'll be more telling if more telling than if I try to philosophize on that. I attended one of the last shows by Grandanskaya Barona in Moscow in the mid-2000s. So Yegor Letov, the frontman, died in 2008, so it was just maybe a year before that. And to get into the venue, there was a huge line of people, and I think I had some special pass as a journalist or something. I don't remember, or it was just a different kind of ticket. I don't know. I just remember passing this huge line of people and looking at those people. They were so diverse, ranging from like teenage punks to executive types to very, very good-looking women in their late 30s and early 40s. It was, I think it's kind of a phenomenon by itself. If a Siberian punk band was able to attract so many different people, I think it may say something about that.
So it must have touched lives, many lives.
I think so. I think so.
Do you want to sneak in a super quick final question?
Yes. You mentioned that the mood of their talk was a little bit bitter, and before that you said that they might have not reached the kind of goals that they might have wanted to, even back in the day or even nowadays thinking back at it. And you also said that they don't really talk to each other anymore, they kind of don't like each other. Why do you think that? I'm a very empathetic person, and you know, people's emotions and feelings kind of like, I really am into that kind of stuff. Why do you think they don't really like each other? Or
They've had many differences. It's well, they've been playing music for a long time. They've had all kinds of differences, financial differences. Who is supposed to be paid for what? They've had political differences because later in the 1990s, some of those Siberian punk rock musicians, they actually took a rather dubious political path, and they've had very basic, immature rock music differences over who really started the band, who was really the main person in the band. All kinds of those things led to it. Plus, again, by objective standards, except for maybe Yegor Letov, who again died more than 10 years ago, none of them achieved any financial success or any proper recognition. And of course, imagine people in their early 50s who are basically who are not really successful by objective standards, and they just they had all reasons to be bitter, and they expressed their bitterness against each other rather than something else.
Okay, thank you very much.